Hey, beautiful soul. Welcome to Spirit Speakeasy. I'm Joy Giovanni, Joyful Medium. I'm a working psychic medium, energy healer, and spiritual gifts mentor. This podcast is like a seat at the table in a secret club, but with mediums, mystics, and the spiritual luminaries of our time. So come behind the velvet ropes with me and see inside my world as I chat insider style with profoundly gifted souls. We go deep, share juicy stories, laugh a lot, and it wouldn't be a speakeasy without great insider secrets and tips. You might even learn that you have some gifts of your own. So step inside the Spirit Speakeasy. Hey, beautiful soul. I am really honored to get to talk to our guest today. I'm a fan of hers and I follow her on social media. If you do too, you will know who she is. Her name is at Hospice Nurse Penny, and she creates these really fun and sometimes dark humor pieces, reels and stories and posts around death and dying, and shares her experience as a hospice nurse with her own patients transitioning and also with, people going through their grieving process, and her suggestions. She works not only with patients and families, but also with other healthcare professionals. So she has so much wisdom to share on the death and dying process, the transition process, both from a patient perspective and a family perspective and a healthcare perspective, and the grieving process and all of the parts that go along with that. And so I was so excited when she agreed to come onto the pod and talk to us because, all of us either have lost someone that we have loved and have questions about that transition process. All of us will cross over ourselves someday. And I know it's so powerful, this work that she's putting out in the world to try to help soften or break down fears, misunderstandings, misconceptions around death, dying, the hospice process, and everything involved. So without further ado, I am going to just bring you into my conversation with Hospice Nurse Penny. Welcome in and welcome back to Spirit Speakeasy. If you are a returning listener, if you're a new listener, I'm so happy to have you. You have chosen a great episode to listen to. I'm going to just launch into our guest's bio because I'm so excited to have her here and I have so many questions for her. Today, we are with Penny Smith, who is a nationally certified hospice and palliative care registered nurse. She has over 17 years experience working in a variety of hospice care setting roles, including inpatient, home case management, education, quality, and regulatory. She currently works as a hospice quality manager for an organization in Washington State. Penny is a passionate advocate for hospice education with a mission to normalize the end-of-life process to remove the stigma and fear around hospice care, death, and dying. During the pandemic, Penny found her way to social media, where she discovered a unique way to utilize all of her death care expertise to provide education to a worldwide audience at a grassroots level. Using a variety of teaching styles, including TikTok trends, dark humor, dancing, and storytelling, she's gathered over 1 million followers across her social media platforms. You can find her on all the platforms: TikTok, Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, at Hospice Nurse Penny, which of course I'll link in the show notes. But help me welcome Nurse Penny. Hi, I'm so happy to have you here with us.
Hi there. Thanks for having me.
I just am so excited to hear your stories and your perspective. I'm a medium, so I talk to people maybe on the other side of their transition, but you're with them in those very amazing and special last moments of their life.
Yes, yes.
I want to understand a little bit about you and your journey. Now, you said you've got more than 17 years experience. What led you into palliative care or hospice nursing?
Well, first of all, I was a late bloomer when it came to becoming a nurse. I didn't go to nursing school until I was 40. And when I finally did, I wanted to do something that had to do with service work. My ex-husband's stepmother, had been on hospice, and I was just so impressed by the nurses. I loved their compassion, their autonomy, their ability to practice, with so much autonomy, knowledge, and I felt like that was service work. So I didn't go into hospice right away because you do have to have some experience under your belt if you want to be a hospice nurse. But I was
Yeah.
fortunate enough that after about 15 months of being a nurse in a clinic and then for a short time in a hospital, a hospice care center was opening up in the neighborhood, and they happened to be hiring at that time. So I went and applied, and I got the job, and I was able to learn everything, there in the inpatient center. So I was, I always say I was at the bedside of the dying on the regular. It was just very in your face,
Wow.
death and dying. And I worked with other really experienced hospice nurses who helped to train me. So,
Well, let me just take a moment to thank you for all of your service. I think nurses sometimes are the unsung heroes and certainly the glue in medical facilities. I've had a lot of nurses in my life, and you guys do amazing work that is not highly rewarded enough, in my opinion. As you transitioned into this work doing hospice care, how did you find ways to manage your own grief or your overwhelm as a professional?
I have never really felt like, I mean, there were times when I was with family members and it was kind of sad, but
Yeah.
as a nurse, it's my responsibility to be taking care of the patient and the family. The expected outcome is death. It's not like
Right.
I was working in a hospital where the outcome is curative. You're trying to save people. When you're a hospice nurse that that is what is going to happen. That person is going to die, and you are there to support them. You're there to make sure they're comfortable. You're there to make sure their family is educated. They know what to expect. They're not afraid of what's unfolding for them. And when the person dies, if you've done all of those things, it's a job well done. So I have
Yeah.
never really experienced a lot of grief around my role as a hospice nurse. There's been times when it was emotionally taxing or stressful if I had,
Right.
some dynamics that were challenging. But it wasn't ever like a real sadness from losing these people. They are my patients. They're not my family. So it's a different emotional attachment that you have with them. It's not like, when my dad died, I grieved over my dad's death, but
Right.
these are not my family. And so I think that's really important. And I think that as a hospice nurse, if you work in hospice and you are unable to have that emotional boundary, that's what I call that, as an emotional boundary, then you won't last. You're not able to do it because it can be really traumatizing and sad to people who can't separate themselves in that way.
Yeah, and I would imagine it could be, like you said, emotionally taxing if someone isn't holding that boundary, which is probably a large part of your work on the education side with other hospice care nurses, right?
Oh yes, definitely.
So I love that you have been able to maintain this boundary and be in the space, supporting the family, supporting your patient. Obviously, with that being primary, like you said, would you mind sharing some of your personal experiences with people that are in those last phases of transition as it relates to you have one. Okay, I have to tell you, I'm a social media fan of yours. I really enjoy all of the reels that you put out. I'm thinking of one in particular of a patient that you had that was starting to become aware of his wife and that was talking about her coming to retrieve him.
Yeah, that's when that See, I don't cry when I get sad. I cry when I get choked up. And that's one of my very favorite experiences working in hospice. I had been working in hospice at that point for over 5 years, so I had seen visioning often. When people are at the end of their life, it's very, very common for them to vision deceased loved ones and even pets. Usually it's people, but I have had patients who saw pets. And I was at the nurse's station, and his room was right next to the nurse's station, and I heard him yelling, and I went into the room to see what was going on, and he was looking up at the corner of the room and he was crying. He had tears just pouring down his face, and he was yelling, "Ingrid, Ingrid." And I stood there and watched him for a minute, and then I said, "Was Ingrid your wife?" And he said, "Yes, yes, she's right there. I see her." And I said, "Is she coming to get you?" And he said, "Yes, yes, but not today, tomorrow." I said, "Oh, okay." And I'm thinking, well, that's specific. He didn't die the next day. He died the day after that. And then when the caregiver who had taken care, so Ingrid died a year before my patient did. The caregiver who had taken care of Ingrid and my patient came in to pick up his belongings. And I told her the story. And without missing a beat, she said, "Oh, it was always like Ingrid to be late."
And I love that story when I saw it too, because it's for me, part of the way that I practice mediumship is those validations. So it's just that extra validation of like, oh yeah, that's so much her personality.
Yeah.
How frequently do you see this with patients? I hear it a lot, or from the spirit side, they often will articulate or express to me exactly what you're saying, that someone was there to receive them, that they didn't experience that fear that we sometimes might assume. Is that pretty commonplace?
Yes, definitely. It's common, and I mean, after you've seen it enough, you sometimes don't even, you're not even asking them about it anymore. It's just very, it's, it's so profound to see somebody visioning. It's like you think there's something wrong with you for not being able what they see. And
Wow.
sometimes people can have visions weeks before their death. So oftentimes when I do my reels, my stories about this, I'll have people in my comments saying, it's just hallucinations. It's caused by the drugs. It's caused by their disease. And I always say, it's not. These are people who are not necessarily even taking any medications yet. It's weeks before
Yeah.
their death. They're completely cognitively intact. They're aware. They can tell us what they see. But oftentimes, when a person is closer to the end of life and they're not communicating with us verbally anymore, we see people reaching into the air or reaching up to the corner of the room. That's really very common. And I have come to believe that they are seeing those visions. They're reaching for those visions. They're just not able to articulate that's what they're doing because they're not verbal
Yeah.
anymore.
Well, and I love that you express that, like, hey, there are people who challenge and say, oh, is this the medication? Oh, is this, the hallucination of the mind? And so I love from your medical perspective that you're saying, no, in fact,
Yeah.
they're often not even on medication. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, and also another thing people say is DMT. I get that a
Hmm.
lot. It's DMT, it's dimethyl, try something, I don't know, chemical.
Being released in the brain, do you
Yeah,
mean?
yeah. And so my take on that is always, it's, before I knew what DMT was all about, I would just reject that out of hand when somebody said, "It's DMT." I'd say, "No, it's not. There's no studies that have been done on humans that can prove that it's DMT." And again, it's not medication. Patients are not necessarily taking meds. They don't necessarily have a disease that involves their brain. They're
Right.
clear, they're cognitively intact, they're not confused at all. But as I started to kind of dive into DMT, what it is, there were some studies done on rats that show that rats that were um, provoked into having a heart attack were releasing small amounts of DMT in their brain. So I started looking at, different information about DMT, and I read that DMT is naturally occurring in plants and animals, and that historically DMT has been used by Native Americans, or any other, uh, what's the word I'm looking for, tribes, in other
Yeah, like indigenous groups and
indigenous groups.
practitioners.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Indigenous groups, yes, and practitioners will consume plants that have DMT to elevate their consciousness and their ability
Yeah.
to communicate with the spirit world. So I now have taken the stance of maybe it is DMT, but that does not necessarily rule out the fact that they could actually be communicating with spirits. It just makes
Yeah.
them able to. So,
Right, just maybe a little clearer for them, or a little more
yeah.
part of their experience than it would normally be, enhanced, like you're saying.
Exactly. Yeah.
Wow.
So they're not necessarily mutually exclusive. Yes, it might be caused
Yeah.
by DT, but that does not cancel out the fact that it
Yeah, it
could
doesn't
actually,
negate.
exactly, there could still be spirits.
Yeah.
They're just now able to communicate with them because of that heightened level of awareness.
Well, and I love having the scientific understanding behind it, because I'm just not a medium who puts everything immediately to the spirit world either. I want to know, like, okay, like you're saying, like, what is the validity of this? What do we know scientifically? And I like that. I have to tell you, I like that there's, it's not mutually exclusive. One doesn't preclude the other. So that's really nice to know on the medical side. Do you feel like through your years of experience, your understanding has changed, or did you always believe, in the spirit world or in something after this?
No, no, I didn't. And I wasn't raised with religion, so I had just no concept of afterlife. I didn't and don't believe in heaven or hell. I wasn't sure if we're reincarnated. I didn't know. I had death anxiety severely when I was in my 30s. And it really wasn't until I became a hospice nurse and started witnessing people visioning at the end of life. I had never heard about that. I never heard anything about
Wow.
that prior to working in hospice. And then once I started to see that, I kind of developed my own feelings and beliefs around an afterlife. I think that there is, so there's something. And then my dad died. I had been a hospice nurse for 5 years, and my dad died, and he actually came to me after his death, and that was like that sealed the deal for me. I was like, "Yep, I knew it. I
Wow.
knew it."
Well, I'm so sorry for the loss of your dad. I'm sure that was profound in and of itself. Would you be open to sharing a little bit about that visitation from him?
Sure, sure. So my dad, a little bit about my dad and my family. My dad got idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis from lifelong smoking. He was a jet mechanic,
Wow.
worked around asbestos, and his death came really quickly. He was on hospice only for 12 hours, and that was after I
Wow.
had to call the pulmonologist and say, we need a hospice referral, because they
Yeah.
kept telling me, oh, no, we know what it is. We're going to be able to treat it. We're going to fix it. And then he ended up in the ICU. And I was like, this is
Wow.
not good. So my dad was very resigned to his death. And, most of the time when people die a natural death, it's a progression towards the end. Like there's a dying process. People don't just drop dead. They don't say their last words and then close their eyes and they're dead. There's a process. They become
Right.
unresponsive and then they slip away. Every now and then you get people who do just, they're gone like that. And I heard a saying once that in order for death to occur, the spiritual side and the physical side have to meet. And then when that happens, death occurs. My dad was physically ready and he was just spiritually there. As far as I know, my
Okay.
dad was an atheist. He never talked about any belief in afterlife, but he was just ready. He was just like, I'm done. This is good. We all had our time with him, even though he was only on hospice for 12 hours. It was a fantastic day. We got him his favorite meal. Each
Oh,
one of us
wow.
had time with him. And so it was really good. And he literally said well, let me tell you though. So this is what happened. So we had been at the hospital with him after we got him his last meal. My brother and I went back to my mom's house and stayed there because we both lived far away, and we had come, you know, to stay with her while my dad was in the hospital. My dad had a hospital bed in the downstairs room, and he was supposed to come home on hospice the next day, and I was going to be his nurse. So he has
Okay.
this bed downstairs, and we get there, and my mom goes up to bed, and I'm laying in this hospital bed, and my brother is on the computer in the corner of the room, same room I'm in. And my dad was a collector of things, and he had hats. He had this collection of hats. And on a beam above the where I was laying in this hospital bed, this was in a family room, he had like all these hats hanging up there. And I was just laying in bed looking up. It's really, really late. I'm looking up those hats and I'm thinking, look at all those hats hanging up there. He's got so many hats hanging up there. And the phone rings, and it was the nurse, and she said, you need to come now. And I didn't even ask. I was like, okay. Got my
Yeah.
brother, got my mom. We get in the car and we start driving to the hospital. On the way there, the nurse calls my brother's phone, and I answered it because he was driving. And I said, yeah, we just talked. What's going on? And she said, your dad just died. And I said,
Wow.
oh, okay. So we get to the hospital, and she knew I was a hospice nurse. And she said, do you want to know what happened? And I said, yes. And she said, he was getting pretty short of breath. So I gave him some morphine. I went back to check on him, and he said, I'm about ready to hang it up. And she said, I went and got him some lorazepam, and when I came back, he was having agonal breaths and he died a few minutes after that. So that was my first kind of like, wow, I felt like it was a shared death experience. I was laying in that
Wow.
bed looking at those hats up there, thinking, look at all those hats hanging up there. And he
Yeah.
was telling the nurse, I'm about ready to hang it up, which was
That's amazing.
totally within my dad's character to say something like that. So after that, we all stayed at my mom's house for several weeks. We're a very tight family. We were putting together a DVD, planning the memorial service, and my husband, who had been watching my teenage daughters, his stepdaughters, brought them down for the weekend because they were in school. So he brought them for the weekend, and we went over and stayed at my sister's house. And I was sleeping, and I always have to say this wasn't a dream, but I was
Yeah.
asleep. And my dad came to me, and he was warm and brilliant, bright orange energy. And it was
Wow.
his voice. And he said, it's time to go. And I said, oh, okay. And then I said, but I'm going to have to say goodbye to my kids. They're really going to miss me. And he said, no, no, it's not time for you to go. It's time for me to go. And I said, oh, okay. And I said, I love you, Dad. And he said, I love you. And we just said, I love you. Goodbye, goodbye. And he just faded away, and the warmth left, and it got dark. And I woke up crying. And my husband said, you were talking to your dad. And I said, no, my dad was talking to me. And it was just
Wow.
like, so you can't, when you have an experience like that, you just can't even do it justice by talking about it. Like I can't,
Yes.
unless somebody else has had the experience, because
No, I mean, exactly, and it's we call it the mystical experiences, right? And I complain about it constantly that the language is just not matching up, and so I think that's why a lot of people have misconception about what it is and what it isn't, and how it feels, just because the language is difficult to translate this powerful experience of your dad, showing up in the way that you would need, and giving you that closure that you would need. Like, how beautiful is that? That's so amazing.
I love the way you just said the way that you would need, because my sister also had an experience with my dad. My brother never did, that he tells us, but my brother is very much an atheist, has no belief in the afterlife whatsoever. And my mom had a different experience. So my sister
Oh, wow.
was going through a really hard time with my niece, who was a drug addict at the time, and my sister was just going through hell. She had bought a house for my niece and her husband to rent. She was faced with having to evict them. She was faced with having to get emergency custody of her
Oh,
granddaughter.
wow. So
uh,
tough.
it was really, really rough. And then she started to meditate. Her husband taught her how to meditate. And my dad was coming to her on a bench with a dark figure, and saying to her, like, you know what you got to do, and guided her through this whole thing. It was amazing. My sister,
Wow.
who has never been religious, she's still not religious, but never been spiritual, never believed in God, now does. It was very, very life
Wow.
changing. And then my mom, who's agnostic, has always said, I don't believe in an afterlife. But she kept telling me about how she was seeing these wisps. She calls them wisps. She says, I see a wisp every now and then out of the corner of my eye, and I hear Dad's voice. And usually he's
That's
telling me,
funny.
like, I need to be careful or do. And she finally, and I was like, Mom, it sounds like you're being visited, and she finally had to admit, that she had to get past this stigma of believing in a spirit
Yeah.
to be able to say, yeah, I do think it's Dad. And she recently told me it wasn't happening as much anymore, but it was so interesting, because she said, I just see this wisp, and then I'll hear Dad's voice, and he says, be careful with that, like if she's out working with garden
Yeah.
tools or something like that.
That's
So
so funny. Well, my favorite thing about, thank you for sharing those amazing experiences. One of my favorite things about it is it does show the intelligence that they still have. That we're a soul. I know you believe this, because I love your favorite quote. You can share it with us, but we're a soul having this human experience, and then our soul leaves and continues on. And it just shows the intelligence of your dad being able to know how each of you might need to hear from him, what's going on in your lives. And I think it's funny with your mom too, that we often have these experiences and just kind of like dismiss them or think like, oh, it's just a wisp or it's just and you're like, okay,
Hmm.
well, what is that? Like, what do you mean it's just a wisp? Like, but we just something in us, it resonates with us. We know it's true, and then we just sort of dismiss it based on our cultural norms. It's like an interesting thing that happens, I think.
Yeah, yeah.
And I love that your dad's still communicating with you and saying hellos in different ways to each of you, which is so special.
Yeah, he hasn't for a long time. I mean, after everything resolved with my niece, who, by the way, has been sober, clean and sober now for 7 years,
Oh,
and
that's wonderful.
got custody of her kids back from my sister,
That's
and
so
and they
great.
have a fantastic relationship, better than ever. And my
Wow.
sister really felt like the as this whole situation moved forward, my dad started to fade. The dark being was still there, and then eventually they were both gone. For me, it
Wow.
was just the one encounter, and when my family questioned me and said, "Why you and why not us?" in the beginning, before any of them had any experience,
Mhm.
I said, "I think it's because I'm really connected to death through my work,
Yeah.
very connected to death. And I think that's why I was able to receive that." But he said goodbye
Yeah.
to me. He left, and he's never
I
been
love it.
back.
Well, I think it's interesting too because sometimes, from my perspective anyway, I feel like sometimes it's just where we are in the grieving process because they know that it's a transition for us who stay behind as well. So maybe you just, like you said, you have a little more experience with death. Maybe you're just in a different place with your grieving process.
Yeah, I think so too, and that's true. Everybody has a different way that they process grief, and I think
Yeah.
that it could be something that and I think some people, like my mom, probably that didn't happen for her for years. My dad's been dead for 12
Wow.
years, and it didn't happen until probably about 4 years ago, that she
Wow.
mentioned it. It might have been happening sooner than that, but I think
Yeah.
she was in too much grief to be able to
Yeah.
experience that. I think that can be a barrier to having that experience. If you're grieving too much, you can't receive
Yeah.
that. You're not ready
I
for it.
agree. Yeah, I think for my perspective anyway, I think one element of it is them honoring the grieving process and knowing we need to continue to process. And then the other thing is that, as I'm sure you experience a lot, sometimes our human emotions are so loud, or, our grief is so loud, our processing, that we might not be as aware of those subtle experiences.
Right. We're not receptive to it because you're
Yeah.
exactly true that the grief is just it's overweighing everything else. You can't rise above that to receive any other information because you're trying to
Yeah.
process everything that comes with grief, which can be very complicated.
Yes, and I feel like I have so many things I wanna say right now. Well, one, I love that that was the experience, with your dad that shifted your perspective and kind of opened you up to maybe more of understanding around those experiences that I wanna hear more about. But another big part of what you do in your social media through your platform is educate people who are experiencing the grief of the transition process. So I would love for you to either talk about that a little bit or just give any tips or things that you feel like people should know who are kind of in that transition process from this side.
One of the tips that I like to give people is for those who are dealing with people in grief, which
Yeah.
is let people grieve. They have to feel their feels. I so many times will have somebody reach out to me and they'll tag me in a video and they'll say, "Can you help this person? They're really grieving." And my response is, "No, I can't." People have to go through what they're going through. You have to allow that.
Yeah.
There's no words I can say that's going to make them not grieve. You can't fix
Yeah.
it. You have to work through that grief. You can't just avoid it. And if you avoid it, it's just going to come back, with a vengeance. You have to really
So
work
true.
through it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Feel the
That's really
feels.
true. And that actually was going to be one of my questions is for people, maybe they're a little bit outside of that circle. Maybe it's not their loved one that's passed, but maybe it's a coworker or a neighbor or a friend. What are some good ways to let them know that you're caring about them, but not trying to tell them it's okay and quiet down their grief? Is there some, I don't know, are there some words that you suggest or what's the best way to approach it?
Well, we don't always have to have words. That's the first thing.
Yeah.
People think there needs to be something they can say, and it's not necessarily, you know, if you feel like you have to say something, it's a good chance you're not going to say the right thing or it's not the
Right.
right time.
Yeah.
Sometimes you can just sit with someone quietly and hold space with them. Something that I've learned a lot about as far as grief since I've been, because I dealt with grief during my role as a hospice nurse, and now through social media have learned a lot more about it as well because people ask me about it
Yeah.
so much, and I have access to grief support services through my agency. But um, asking somebody to tell you about their person is helpful to people who
Yeah.
are grieving. Tell me about your favorite memory. um, of course, always offering to help, though somebody in grief might not accept help. So sometimes saying, I'm going to do this for you, or, you know, I think that's even more helpful than, it's definitely not helpful to say, I know how you feel. He's in a better place. At least he's not suffering.
Right.
It's okay if the person who's grieving says something like that, like at least he's not suffering anymore. That's okay. I feel I would feel that way about a person who was dying that was close to me if they were in a lot of
Yeah.
pain or whatever. But for someone else to say that is it's not helpful at all. It's better just
Yeah.
to say nothing, and just to let people know, I'm here for you. What can I do for you? Or if you know what they need, I'm going to do this for you.
Yeah. Well, I think that's so important what you just said because I feel like sometimes saying, even though it's our human nature to want to offer some comfort, it can feel dismissive. It can feel all kinds of things that it's not intended, right?
Right.
How do you feel about? I've noticed that sometimes I feel like people that are grieving appreciate, like, if you did know their loved one who's crossed over, for you to share a story about how that person touched your life.
Yes, that's another thing you can do definitely is to say, I remember when, Mr.
Yeah.
Johnson, saw me down the street and waved me over and gave me some oranges off his tree or whatever, like some nice
Yeah.
little memory. That definitely is something else that's, if you're familiar enough with the person that has died and you can do that,
Yeah.
absolutely, absolutely.
I had a good friend who lost her dad, and she said when people would do that, it was almost like getting little slivers of him, almost like a little gift of a new memory that she didn't know about, but could feel his personality in that. Kind of like you were saying, how it would be such your dad's personality to say, I'm going to hang it up. Like it's just that
Hmm.
little sliver of them again.
Oh, yeah. I mean, that's what meant so much to me when my dad died. She could have said, "I'm sorry about your loss," every hour for the next, 24 hours, and it wouldn't have meant as
Yeah.
much to me as telling me
That
that this was,
validation.
yeah, exactly. And
Yeah.
and
How
it's
amazing.
and it is okay too to say I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Some people say, "No, don't say you're sorry. It's not your fault." But I've spoken with many hospice social workers who also say it's totally fine to say, "I'm so sorry for your loss. I'm so sorry to hear about your
Yeah.
mom." I mean, that is simple, and I always feel like you can't go wrong with that.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's great advice. I want to circle back to something that you said about your own death anxiety, is I think what you called it, which I
Hmm.
feel like is so common for so many people. Would you talk a little bit about death anxiety and maybe some tips or tools you have?
Yeah, and I had no idea how common death anxiety was until I got onto social media. I kind of thought I was probably the only person who had it because when I had it, I was, not a nurse. I wasn't working around
Yeah,
people who died. Um, and I didn't know a lot of people who died. My only, I wasn't close to my grandparents. They grew up far away from me. Like they were in Canada and Texas. I really didn't see them very often. I wasn't close to them, so their deaths didn't impact me. The only death that really impacted me was my cousin who killed herself. She jumped off a bridge when she was 25. And even that, I wasn't really around when that happened. We were living kind of far from each other, and I hadn't seen her for a couple of years. But I just in my 30s started having this anxiety about what happens after we die. What is it like to die? How about when your family, who you're close to, dies? What happens then?
yeah,
Like it would keep me awake at night. It was really overwhelming. It was crippling. And I remember my husband at the time, who is now my ex-husband, would say, well, it won't matter if there's nothing after you. Because I'd be like, what if there's just nothing after we die? And he'd say, well, it won't matter because you won't be
Right.
aware of it
Well,
because there's nothing. And that it was unhelpful to me. Like that was
yeah.
not what I was looking for. Um, and it really wasn't until I started becoming a hospice nurse that I started to have this relief about my anxiety. And it was through, I used to think it was because I saw people visioning and that started to form this belief in an afterlife for me, but it was
Yeah.
more than that. And I didn't realize that it was more than that until recently. um, it was more about being around people who were dying and being exposed to it and not being able to turn away from it, not being able to deny that it exists. It's there.
Yeah.
It's inevitable. It's going to happen to all of us. So as a hospice nurse, my death anxiety was relieved. And then a few years ago, I stopped doing patient care and I went into hospice quality. So I now manage quality for hospice. And I don't have any direct patient contact anymore. I still did a lot of education with nurses and our volunteers about end of life care. I'm involved in complex case reviews, but no direct patient interaction. I started to feel, probably about 4 years ago, I started to feel this death anxiety creeping back up in me.
Oh, wow.
And my thoughts about it were, I'm not doing patient care anymore, and I'm feeling disconnected from death. I'm not feeling
Yeah.
connected to death anymore like I was. Once I got on social media and started really interacting with people on a regular basis about death and dying, educating about it, retelling stories that I've experienced, it
Yeah.
went away for me again. And I realized that it really is that feeling of acceptance. Like if you can get to a place of accepting your mortality, you can get over anxiety because once you're like, yeah, it's going to happen and there's nothing that
Yeah.
I can do to control that, it lives in the background. And it, even if it just
Wow.
starts to creep up every now and then, which it rarely does, but when it does, I'm able just to go, mm-mm, because I just can't control that. So
Yeah.
it's something that I was able to let go of. But it was through comments from people who follow me who say, gosh, ever since I've been following you, I don't have death anxiety anymore. I get that all
Wow.
the time. Like the more that you talk about it, the less I have fear around it. It's a taboo topic. People don't want to talk about it. And when that happens, it's a very unknown subject, and we're always going to have a fear of the unknown. So
Well, you make such a good point because, especially in the US and in several other places, culturally, it is just a taboo or something that we just kind of look the other way with blinders, like somehow it doesn't exist. And that's very, as we know, anything we can't talk about or talk about our emotions around is very anxiety producing or fear producing, which lends itself so beautifully to your mission as an advocate for hospice education to normalize end of life process and remove that stigma and fear around it. Was that your mission before, and then through your experience with social media you kind of doubled down on it, or did you realize that that was your
I
calling?
I realized, when I first got on TikTok, I had no intention of talking about death and dying. I was trying to learn how to shuffle dance. I
I
never
heard you say
did.
that on a reel and I was like, I just love Penny.
Yeah, I never did learn how, but I just one day told a story about a hospice patient and it went viral, and I realized people want to know about this. And I've always been a
Yeah.
passionate advocate for hospice, having been a hospice nurse for so many years, and for normalizing death and dying, because I've been
Yeah.
with so many families who were terrified of what was unfolding with their dying person until I said that's normal. And once I
Right.
said that's normal, they were like, oh, that's normal? Yeah, it's normal.
Yeah.
And so I knew that was something like I started using the hashtag normalize death. Like it's probably in the first video I did about hospice because I
Wow.
knew that was the angle that I wanted to take when I decided that that's what I was going to do. But the unfolding of the death anxiety being a part of all of that and helping people with death anxiety, that is something that it organically started on its like
Yeah.
I did not, like I said, I didn't even know other people suffered from death anxiety when I
It sounds
was.
like it kind of showed up as a common thread in the feedback that you were in, the
Yep.
questions that you were getting, which is so fascinating. Would you mind sharing the story with us that went viral?
Oh, yes. Okay. So that was when I was a new hospice nurse. It was probably within the first year that I became a hospice nurse. And we had a patient, I was in a care center. We had a patient who was an elderly woman, and her daughter was a nun. And so there were lots of nuns that were coming to visit my patient. Um, and it was in the evening, it was Sunday night. And I was at the nurse's station, and the last visitor came out of the room, and she was a nun, and she walked up to me and she said, "She's gone." And I grabbed my stethoscope and I stood up and I said, "Oh." And she said, "No, no, her body is still here doing the work of dying, but her spirit has left. You can see it in
Wow.
her eyes." And I was like, wow. And so she left, and I was like, I got to go check this out. And so I went into the room, and my patient was, actively dying, unresponsive. And she had what we call like the death stare or the heaven
Yeah.
stare or the God stare, where the lights are on, nobody's home. Like they're just
Right.
staring. They're not focused on anything. They just have a very blank stare. And I loved that explanation. And to me, that's how I feel now that's what's happening. Like our physical body stays here and does the work of dying, but the spirit leaves, and you can
Yeah.
you can see it in their eyes.
And how beautiful that you're kind of to go back what you were saying before, that you're able to share all of these experiences that you've witnessed and collected, because it's different. We don't gather in our village or tribal group and witness the passing of elders anymore. And so it's scary. We don't know, until you get to this place, like you're saying, where you have a person that's in hospice, or where you're a hospice nurse or caregiver in some capacity. Maybe you haven't seen these things before to know what's normal and what's scary. And so, what a profound education you can give people. That's so amazing. One of your other reels that you did recently that I found so moving was someone had, I think, sent you a video, or you had seen a video of someone sharing that their mom had become really sick and was in that end of life period, and they wanted to be with her, but they didn't want to overwhelm her emotionally. And I felt like you gave some really profound guidance, which I see so many regrets around that last part of someone's life. So I would love for you to share a little bit about that, if you remember which one I'm talking about, which I think
Oh,
you
well,
do.
I think it's the one where she said, I don't want, I just, she said something about, I don't want to cry when
Yeah.
I'm with her. I just need to move on.
Yeah.
And
And
I
trying to keep
said,
strong for her, or whatever it
Yeah,
was.
exactly.
Yeah.
And I said, You do, you cry. It's okay to cry. You're
Yeah.
sad. Your mom is dying, and it's okay for you to cry. And you're not ready to move on because it's not time to move on. Your mom is still here. She's living, and you need to
Yeah.
be with her and hold her and hug her and cry on her and cry with her, and that's okay. You be you when you're with her.
Yeah.
You don't need to hide your emotions, because your mom knows your heart, and she knows, who you are, and you can be who you are. You don't have to try to be
Mm.
strong. You don't have to try to let go. It's you'll move on when you're ready, but you'll never stop
Yeah.
grieving. You'll always grieve your loss. That's the thing about grief. People don't just get over it. You don't ever get
Right.
over it. I still, from time to time, I'll feel sad about my dad's death. It's normal. Grief it's not linear, and it never goes away. It's always with us, but we learn how to live with it.
That's such a good point. We talk about it here a lot, just because I feel like it's our cultural or maybe human nature to say, like, okay, I'm going to move past this or get over this, check this box, and then I'm going to just leave this behind me. And as we know with grief, it's not like that. Actually, the Helping Parents Heal group taught me this amazing analogy that they use, which is that we're standing in the ocean, of grief, and some waves are big and knock you down, and over time you learn how to stand in some of the smaller waves, but the waves always continue to come. It's just they might affect you differently, at certain times. And just being able to, be, we do have to continue on in some way in our human life. We've got groceries to buy and things to do, but still honoring that grieving process and not expecting it to just somehow be something we're ticking off a to-do list, right?
Yeah, I love that analogy. The waves. I might need
Yeah.
to use that in a reel.
Yeah, you should. It just made so much sense, and to hear the way that they express it, because I would imagine, I don't know that loss is measurable, because I feel like any loss has gravity to it, but I feel like sometimes it's could just feel different if it's more time to prepare for it versus less time to prepare, or
I
not that
don't know.
there's a more or less, but just
I hear
different.
that. I hear that from people where they'll ask, is it better to die suddenly or is it better to have an expected death over time?
Yeah,
And you could make a case for either way,
yeah. I think it's
because
just different, right?
yeah, it's different. Like if you
Yeah,
know that your person is dying and then they die, you're planning for that. It doesn't make it easier than if
right.
somebody dies suddenly and you weren't planning for that. Both
Yeah,
situations have the same outcome. Your person is dead.
yeah,
So
exactly.
it's hard to say like is one better than the other. I think death
Yeah,
is
I
death and
don't think one's yeah, I don't think one's better. I don't think one's easier. I think it's just different
yeah,
circumstances and different maybe some different elements to consider either way. I feel like it's, there's challenges no matter what. And I think it's so important what you just said, that still giving someone, or allowing ourselves even, to have permission to feel like we have equal, permission to grieve, whether we were expecting someone to pass or not.
right, exactly.
So important.
Hmm.
Um, well, I want to talk about, shift gears a little bit and talk about a retreat that you have coming up in the fall, because I feel like it'll give plenty of time for people to investigate it. I know you said it's in Boone, North Carolina, coming up in September. Will you share a little bit about that with us?
Yeah, so myself and Hospice Nurse Julie, who is another social media hospice nurse, are hosting a retreat at the Art of Living Retreat Center in Boone, North Carolina, September 15th, the weekend of September 15th. It's going to be a lot of fun. It's a beautiful, beautiful location. There's going to be yoga and meditation and things like that
Wow.
that we are not in charge of. But we will be facilitating discussions about death and dying, caregiving, grief, and we will be helping people to fill out 5 wishes, which is an advance directive that people can have to take home with them and will guide their loved ones to know what they want if they're in a position where they're dying.
Wow. It sounds like such a powerful retreat experience. Who is this retreat for, would you say?
It's for anybody. It's for nurses, it's for non-nurses, it's for somebody who has a person who's on hospice, it's for somebody who is facing, a life-limiting or even terminal disease. It's for anybody who's interested in attending and learning more about death and dying.
That's amazing. And how powerful to have such a mixed group of people. The truth is, we all know at some point we're all going to know someone who passes away. At some point, we're all going to pass away ourselves. So there's always lots for us to learn and explore about it, I think.
Yes. So I can send you the link for you to put in your show notes for
Yeah,
that if
that'd be
anyone's
great. Send the
interested.
link, and I'll put it in show notes. And also, I know that you've got in your Instagram page at or on your Instagram page, I should say, at Hospice Nurse Penny, you've got a link tree in the bio where they can find it as well. So I'll link all of that in the show notes, so no one has to worry about memorizing it. Um, I want to shift gears again and shift into the Spirit Speed Round, which are 4 really fun questions. I'm so curious to hear your answers about them. I think we all have a little bit of different answers. Are you game? Are you up for the
I
speed
am
round?
I am up
Okay,
for the speed
exciting.
round.
Yes. Um, Nurse Penny, share one thing that really shocked you or was unexpected about your work in hospice care as a nurse.
Uh I would say what really shocked me and was unexpected was seeing that people overall who are going through a naturally dying process go through many, many, many similar symptoms, if you will, of dying.
Yeah.
That was a surprise to me. I mean, I didn't know anything about the dying process when I became a
Yeah.
hospice nurse. I knew nothing about it. But to find out that there are these hallmark signs that people have when they're dying, was pretty shocking to me. Like we kind of all die the same when we die a natural death.
That's so interesting. So there are actual markers that you, as a healthcare professional, are kind of tracking and looking for the same kind of group of similar symptoms or things that are happening.
Yeah, and some of them are physical, some of them are physical, and some of them are, you know, more, I guess, um, spiritual, if you will. And people speak in metaphors at the end of life. They talk about going on a trip, going home,
Wow.
and then the visioning, and the reaching, and that is something that is not a physical medical thing, but it's so common that we actually use that as part of our assessment when we're trying to decide if we think somebody's getting close to the end of their life.
Wow, that's so fascinating. I had no idea that that was part of the assessment.
Hmm.
Oh, that's an amazing. I love your answer. If you got to spend a day in the spirit world, you know, based on whatever you believe is there, you got the full tour, got to spend time with everyone you've ever known who's crossed over, and it's almost time for you to come back and return to your life. And your guide tells you you have 1 hour left, and you can spend it with anyone at all who's on the other side. Who do you choose and why?
I would choose my cousin who killed herself, because I think my dad's good. Like he's fine where he's at. But I've
Yeah,
always felt really bad about my cousin. People who commit suicide or end their own lives, clearly are suffering, and
yeah.
so I'd want to be with her and let her know that I'm there for her, and you know
Oh, that's so beautiful.
that I care about her, because I don't think felt that she was cared about.
Wow, that's really profound. Thank you for sharing that. Even though we have spiritual gifts and gifts of helping other people, we have very human lives, sometimes mundane. What's one quirky thing about you that people might be surprised to learn?
A quirky thing about me is that
Yeah.
I talk to myself all the time. If nobody's around, I I actually will have arguments with people in my mind, like actually talk and say out loud. If I have conversations with people
I love
that
it.
aren't here, I don't
I
know
love
why.
it.
And I talk to my cat too, so I talk
Oh,
to my
that's fun.
cat
Do you
a
do both
lot.
sides of the conversation or just your side?
I do. I speak out loud my side of the conversation, but in my head, I don't speak out loud their side. But in my head, I'm definitely thinking about what they're saying to me, because I have to know how I'm responding to that. So I
I
do
love
out
it.
loud say what I would say, but I only hear. I'm not like split personality.
Yeah, it's funny. I feel like I do that sometimes, and I write an email 1,000 times in my mind with all the possible twists and outcomes. I like that. Um, Leave us with a pearl of wisdom. What's one piece of advice or wisdom that you wish that you had early on in your understanding of death and the dying process?
Death is inevitable, and the best way to have a good death is to get to a place of acceptance.
That's really profound. Do you feel like there's anything that people can do at different stages and phases in their life to be more prepared, or are there certain things that you recommend
Yes.
people do?
Yes, definitely. I always say legacy work is something that can help you to get to a place of acceptance. And that would be even something as, benign as looking through a photo album and pulling out pictures that you don't want to live on after you. Like if you're
Wow.
intentionally thinking, I don't know, thinking once I die, I don't want people to see this photo. It's not a very good one of me. Or like one thing I used to do, and my daughters were teenagers when I started doing hospice, and so it drove them nuts. But a song would come on the radio, and I'd say, "Hey, if I'm ever dying, I want you to play that song for me." So
Yeah.
like that type of little thing that you can start to think about. And then, of course, as you get older, doing the 5 wishes is really helpful. And that is, advanced directives, not just do I want CPR or to be on a ventilator or whatever, but it's I want to be treated with joy, or, like I want people to be quiet when I'm dying. I want harps playing, or I want people to be laughing and telling jokes. That type of thing is
Oh,
in the
wow. I
five
didn't even know this
wishes.
was a thing that you could make five wishes. Will you talk more about this five wishes?
Yeah.
I'm so interested.
Yeah, the five wishes is fivewishes.org, and it's really easy to fill out. It's actually I think 48 states now recognize it as a legal advance directive. You just have to get two
Wow.
witnesses to sign it. And it does have, like I said, things about tube feeding, things about a ventilator. If you are found to be, in a condition where you are not likely to recover, do you want to be on a ventilator? And then it has things like, I want prayer at my bedside. I want this, I want that. And what I want my family to know about me. And it's got where you can write things in. And it's just very, I always say, and I've talked about it a lot on my social media, even if you don't live in a state where it's a legal advance directive, it's such a great guide to help
Yeah.
you. Oh, you know what? And while I'm talking about it too, here's another thing. If people are wanting to start getting to that place of acceptance and wrapping their brain around death, is the death deck
Oh my gosh, it
is,
was on my list to ask you. I made a sticky note earlier today. I'm so
yeah.
happy you brought this up.
And they have the EOL deck now. So yeah, this is a game. It's a card game, and it's fun and it's funny. It's got dark humor in it, and
Will you
it's
pull a
got,
couple cards from there just
yeah,
so we can kind of
sure.
get a vibe of it? Where do we get this death deck?
The
I'm literally so happy you brought this up because there's a sticky note in my kitchen right now with your name with this.
It's the website is thedeathdeck.com, thedeathdeck.com, and they can order it from there. Oh, you're gonna love this. This is the very first card that just came up. Do you believe mediums communicate with the dead?
Oh my gosh, how hilarious
And then it's
is
got
this?
multiple choice. It says,
This is where I'm like, we can't make this stuff up.
A, yes, I've heard about or experienced some amazing insights from a medium. B, not sure, but it's at least good for some entertainment value. Or C, no, they deliver nothing but fictitious news.
So funny.
So
Yeah,
it's got all
that's a great
kinds of,
question.
yeah, it's got all kinds of multiple choice questions in here like that. Then it's got some fill in the blank type questions. Would you attend a pet funeral? If you
That's
had to
funny.
choose one of these classic gruesome movie deaths, which would it be? It's just a fun way to start having a conversation about death and dying.
Yeah.
And all of those things just open your awareness to the fact that, we are going to die someday. And if you can just get to that place, you will have a much better death. I've had patients who were okay with dying. They were writing their own obituary, planning their own memorial, and their deaths went so much better than those who fight it and are afraid to even say the words.
Yeah, and you just you make such a wonderful point about especially like the death deck. It is bringing a little bit of dark humor and a little bit of ease to hard conversations that maybe feel challenging to start, or it's like, all right, let's just pull some of these cards and make silly answers, or kind of normalizing it, which I know is a huge part of your whole mission.
Yeah, I have found that for a lot of people, bringing levity to death and dying is the best way for them to learn from me. And not everybody
Yeah.
likes I get lots of comments from people who think I'm mocking them, or it's inappropriate, or making fun of death, or whatever. But then, I've got many, many more than that who appreciate that. As a matter of fact, I don't know if you know who Perez Hilton is. He's
Yeah.
yeah. So he shared one of my videos yesterday, and I said, "Hey, thanks for sharing." He said, "Oh, what you're doing is so great, and I love that you make it light and funny because it's so much easier for people to be
Yeah.
able to learn from you because you do it that way."
Oh, for sure. It's more palatable, definitely. And as someone who works a lot with people grieving on the other side of a loss, I can tell you, I know lots of my clients would say how powerful it would be for them to receive, the five wish lists, or you know what I mean, just things from their person, because it is such a common worry of people. Did I give this person the end of life experience they wanted? Did I, honor them in a memorial in the way that they might have liked? So this is really just helping your loved ones potentially on the other side of it, who are left behind.
You know what the irony of that is, and I've heard that before too from other mediums. Psychic medium John Edward has said that, people want to know, like, if they did the right thing for their dying
Yeah.
person. That's what they want them to ask. And I always think, why didn't you ask this before they were dead?
Yeah.
That's when you should be asking the question. When we're there
Yeah.
to try and they can't see the forest through the trees, and we're trying to tell them it's okay to give the morphine, it's not going to cause them to die faster. It's okay to tell them that they're dying, that you know that they're dying, so that you can have a conversation and closure. You miss out on
Yeah.
so much if you don't have that conversation. You ignore the elephant in the room, and it's ironic that that's what they want to know after it's too late, when we're
It
like
is so
there to
interesting.
be able to help them with that, if they would just accept that conversation.
Yeah, and it's having the conversation doesn't make it more scary. Not having the conversation's always
Right.
worse. Yeah, I have one more question for you about those final visits sometimes where, you're encouraging people to say the things. What would you say to someone who either their loved one wasn't conscious when they said the things or that they didn't actually say those things? Do you have any like bits of wisdom on the grieving side for them? I mean, I have my own feelings about it, but I'm curious to hear yours.
Well, there are studies that show that people can hear up until the time of death. So we always
Yeah.
encourage people to say what they need to say to their person, whether they're conscious or not. As far as if they've missed saying something that they wish they would have said, that's a hard one. You can recommend that people write things down and
Yeah.
burn it up and let the smoke go into the air. That's, I think, more of the grief support services side of things. They work with
Yeah.
people on that type of thing. But that's why we encourage those conversations ahead of time, so that people don't regret that they didn't say something they wish they would have said.
Wow. And thank you so much for the profound work that you're doing with people as they transition and then supporting just on the advocacy side and on the compliance side of you really are doing amazing work and I'm so grateful that you're in the world. Thank you so much for being here with us today. And again,
Thank
you could
you.
find Hospice Nurse Penny on all of the social media platforms at Hospice Nurse Penny, and we will link the retreat that she's got coming up September 15th in Boone, North Carolina, and all of her contact points in the show notes. Thank you so much, Hospice Nurse
Thank you.
Penny. Well, what did I tell you? That was a great conversation. I feel so blessed and lucky to have gotten to have this conversation with Hospice Nurse Penny and just get a medical understanding and someone from the inside's perspective on death and dying and that process, and how generous of her to share her own personal stories, of how she came to understand and have belief on what might be waiting for us on the other side, so to speak, through her own personal experiences, as she mentioned with the passing of her own dad and then with her patient experiences. So I feel like we are very fortunate. And I'm so grateful to Nurse Penny for sharing so openly, such profound emotions of her own and stories of her experience. Again, as you know, I will have all of the information and contact points for Hospice Nurse Penny in the show notes. Of course, you can find her across all social media platforms at Hospice Nurse Penny, but I'll put those links below. And if you're interested in her retreat coming up in September, I'll have the links for that as well. If you are someone who is wanting to continue conversation with a loved one in the spirit world after their death, of course, you can work with me privately, but I also have a free gift that I've been offering, which is my Sign Magnet 3-day free video mini course. And the last lesson in that course is teaching you how to set up signs with a loved one in the spirit world. So, for example, if you don't feel them around or you don't feel like they've been visiting you, you can actually go through this process that I teach you in this free video workshop, this free video course, and learn how to set up specific signs in the world with your different loved ones in the spirit world so that they can start saying hi to you in a new way, whether they've been doing it all along or whether you haven't felt them in a while or never at all. This process is simple and easy, that anyone can do it, and totally free. Just go to my website, joyfulmedium.com. Right on the home page, you will see Sign Magnet, which is the free 3-day mini course. Just drop your email in there, and then you will also be on my VIP insiders list. So you'll get the link to my free monthly community healing, to the weekly talks that I do, and so much more. So thank you for being here with me today. Let me know how this resonated with you. Let me know if you learned something from Nurse Penny. I am definitely going to get that death card deck, and let me know if you decide to get it too, because I think it's so powerful to open the conversation about death and the dying process. And I feel like it can take so much fear and misunderstanding out of it. So hopefully this conversation was valuable for you. I feel like it was immensely valuable for me, and I feel like it will be for so many. Big thank you again to Hospice Nurse Penny for the time she spent with us, but also for all the amazing work that she puts into the world. Again, I'm a fan and a follower of hers, so I highly recommend checking out her platforms. I really like her style. Thanks again for joining me. Big hugs. Bye for now from inside the Spirit Speakeasy.